Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 12:30 now, and our third and final lecture for the day, which is technically lecture 12, simply called Hispanic American Voices. I neglected to mention one term from the last lecture, and you'll see a pattern here. I keep coming back to the end of the last lecture that I ended about a couple minutes early because I wanted to mention the term that I think is listed in the somewhere in the outline, and that is the ecological Indian. And I think we have alluded to this in different ways already, but it is simply the idea that the romanticizing of Native Americans, even as they have been pushed to the brink, as a kind of noble savage, right? Totally in touch with nature. And you can see that M. Scott Momaday and others have reacted to this because that dehumanizes Native Americans, right? It doesn't allow them to be, again, agents, as we've been talking about, of their own fate. And so that concept, by the way, is given quite a bit of space in, say, Greg Girard's introduction to eco-criticism, but it's a important motif in North America. One reason is that in the I believe, 70s, there was a famous, at the time, campaign for against littering, right? The national parks and all, where they had this famous image that played for a few years of this Native American, very Native American looking man. He has a feather in his hair and all. And he's looking out over the parks, and then he turns this way and you see a tear coming down, right? Now that that was effective, I suppose, but it again romanticizes that notion of the Native American, and he kind of looked like he would fit better in, a century earlier. Secondly, it transpired many decades later that he was not even Native American, the actor, even though he looked it, right? So you can be, there were in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, as long as you kind of looked vaguely the part, right? Ironically, Native Americans will sometimes, so I've read in an essay a few years ago, they'll sometimes get together and have fun pointing at these old movies and say, "Oh, there's Uncle So-and-so," and they're and they're laughing. And so there's a book called Real Indians, Reel, and if you're interested. And I know the name of the author so well, but my mind is blank. But he talks about the fact that, this idea of the distinction between how the dominant culture views them versus what the reality is. And there are studies about things like on the res, as Native Americans say, on the reservation. And there's a comedy sitcom now, all Native American, which is quite funny. And there's even a dead Native American who comes on a horse and talks to them. There's also a great film from 20 years or over maybe 25 years ago called Smoke Signals, which is funny, about modern Native Americans, right? So many of them they struggle with a lot of different issues. So I wanted to mention this ecological Indian as an important trope that I should have said at the end of the last lecture. This does overlap, as I said, with Hispanic Native Americans to some degree. It depends on which group you're talking about exactly. But Jimmy Santiago Baca is an interesting figure whom I didn't know so much about until recently, as I said, I had heard some Native American voices, poets talk, and so on, and maybe I had read Scott Momaday, but I hadn't read much Hispanic American poetry. So what's interesting about Baca is he's half Apache, but he's part Chicano. So he is a classic instance of crossing the borders of identity. Now that, that's not that radical or anything, but he also spent 4 years in prison. So he educated himself, and his poems are beautiful, but they're hard hitting. So here's what, when he exited prison in 1979, he's still writing, still. At the age of 27, he published his first collection of poems. And his poems speak, as he says in an interview, part of this is the quote. He speaks of painful experiences like racism, isolation, being in prison, and loneliness, but also of hope, faith, and love, as he says. As Frederick Luis Aldama has noted, Baca evokes in his poems, quote, the rhythms and sounds of the everyday life in El Barrio, the Hispanic, often poorer sections of American cities. The barrio is kind of well known in mass culture as a nickname. It's not quite the same as a ghetto, but it's similar. But it also is something that now people, some Hispanics who grow up in those environments will take ownership of, right? And be proud of. And so it's working class, especially, this is the Chicano term. So I'll read from one of the poems, at least, in a minute. But Aldama points out that Baca has also written about the arid and scorched land on the Mexican side of the border and the U.S., where factories of American companies exploit men and women. This is well known along the border. Cheap labor, right? The American companies move to Mexico, and the same pollution comes across the border, but also the labor situations are not great. So he evokes these lives as well. In the first of the two poems I assigned, it's called Roots. Baca likens himself to the cottonwood tree in his backyard, a tree whose actions he conveys in violent verbs: knock, mangle, wreck, splinter. The tree is, quote, unquote, a battle-scarred warrior that the speaker, whom we can infer safely is Baca. It doesn't have to be, but in this case it is. He tends to be autobiographical. Feels he resembles, especially in terms of his Mexican roots. The verbs in the second stanza that characterize Baca's roots are different from those in the first stanza, but no less violent. Barn burners, stuck knife blades, clashing, pierced. The cottonwood tree's actions are part of its nature, though, with no malice or forethought. Unlike the Spanish who came to the region in the 1500s, who behaved like all humans with their own interests in mind, so that the knife and the muskets, he mentions, intentionally this old-fashioned gun, require a hand to guide them to violence. So maybe the wood tree has agency, but it doesn't have malice in its actions. But he sees himself in the cottonwood tree to some degree, right? He sees himself as a combination of these attributes. This is how I read it, as the natural and the social. The great Black Mesa Plateau, from which he gets this collection, is called Black Mesa Poems. Remember that we have Devil's Tower? You have to imagine it now. There is a large plateau, right? Mesa just means table, and it's similar to the Hindi word maize, right? Indo-European. But mesa is also used in North America by all the time as a plateau. So I just wanted to give this geographical orientation. And this great plateau shadows humans and trees alike and seems to be a reminder of the comparative insignificance and transience. So the land remains. The second poem, A God Loosened, which I'll read from, is filled with the natural imagery of nature, which mostly seems to celebrate all life forms, even if the speaker likens the woods around his house to the upturned claws of great dead birds. The silent, austerely beautiful scene is abruptly shattered by the noisy flight of a hawk. The latter image and the words around it, shuddering the air with frightful breakage, sound to me like Yeats in many of his poems. But perhaps, and is perhaps like Yeats, Baca reads nature as simultaneously beautiful and dangerous. So it's not unique in that way, with its own being and agency. So let me read this and see what you make of it. A god loosened. The morning quivers softly. The glassy sunlight sparkles into the wet grass. A bluebird flicks from a tree across the marginless blue of the sky. All that drips, glows, hollowing out the full light of life that brightly flashed, and a flickering chill blows the uplifted flame of days shorter and frail. In the upturned claws of the great dead birds that are the snow-weary woods, that's what I was alluding to, surrounding my house, echoes a crumbling and falling of icy sounds, of crisp light leaves, of logs and trunks cracking, and the wings of a hawk, storming from the tangled boughs as if in an underground cavern shuddering the air, in the frightful breakage of silence that seemed an eternal silence hanging there, and a god itself loosened in those terrible feathers. Also, I hear, not consciously on his part, but I hear echoes of Kolatkar's Jejuri there in his poems, a collection of poems. I don't have a specific interpretation of this because I think it's open to interpretation. What I wanted to illustrate was the fact that the environment, even in his backyard, means so much to him and grabs his attention. Now, one useful way of we always want to compare and contrast, right? And find connections and differences with other specimens of the genre, such as Robert Frost, right? So Robert Frost, a very popular poet around the world, wonderful poems, and he writes about similar things. So we have to ask ourselves, what's different, right? What's here? Now, Frost tends to, understandably, talk about his New England farm where you don't have minorities. It's always European settlers, right? Okay, that's what he was surrounded by. That's fine. Here, I think we have to keep in mind the collection of poems. The setting always is shadowed, as I said, by the Black Mesa, right? And the Black Mesa is home to both Hispanics and Native Americans for centuries. So it's hard sometimes to tell them apart. Because after all, if you go to Mexico, and much of South America, you have the mestizaje culture, right? The dominant culture tends to be, the majority, I should say, are mixed blood, Spanish and indigenous. Then you have the relatively more pure indigenous, who again are at the bottom, tend to be at the bottom, like the Zapateca, and you have the small number of elites. For example, the new president of Mexico is Mexican Jewish. Interesting, right? She seems good. I don't know. It's good to have it's just a statement of an observation. So what you do have movements within Mexico against the mestizaje majority. So it's very complicated. But as far as American literature goes, Baca, as I said, classically represents this idea of borderlands. So let me just read from Gloria Anzaldúa. So border studies, of course, is big and it's not that Gloria Anzaldúa has started this, but certainly her book Borderlands slash La Frontera, the New Mestiza, the New Mestiza. So that's a feminine ending. So intentionally, so she's first of all feminist, but also talking about language. She writes it in both Spanish and English, you know. And here's an example of how she mixes it very innovatively. The U.S. border es una herida abierta. You say, wait, what am I reading? Where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. Now, this could apply, as I said, to many border cultures. Some other quotes. Borders, and she has poems. Again, it's hybrid genre. Borders, and she's a professor, I should say, or retired now, but borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and the forbidden are its inhabitants. Another quote, this land, and she could be speaking for Baca, this land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. Defiant. Who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war? Living on borders and in margins, keeping intact one's shifting and multiple identity and integrity is like trying to swim in a new element, an alien element. The answer to the problem, this is the last quote, the answer to the problem between the white race and the colored, between, as was called, between males and females, lies in healing the split that originates in the very foundation of our lives, our culture, our languages, our thoughts. A massive uprooting of dualistic thinking in the individual and collective consciousness is the beginning of a long struggle, but one that could, in our best hopes, bring us to the end of rape, of violence, of war. Powerful, hopeful, but she's hard-hitting in many parts of it. And again, she mixes Spanish with this unapologetically. That's the key, right? Another thing I'd like to read before returning to Baca, and I just have a couple things to say about him, is that one, we can also extend this to Latin American literature at large. Remember I said there's Hispanic, which is broad. There's the more specific Chicano or Latino. One Latin American environmental literary scholar describes it thus. The communal cultural historical significance of the physical environs is also reflected in what is the subject of my investigation, Mexican-American literature and literary history. There, the land and the nature and Mexican-American characters' relation to them. Often one of close rapport has been a prominent theme. Okay. The non-human world already plays an important part in a 1542 text he cites. Kind of obscure one at the moment. The Chronicle of the Spanish Explorer, it's by Cabeza de Vaca. He's still very infamous, but he was a Spanish explorer. But specialists read his journal. His 8-year odyssey from Florida through the parts of the present U.S. Southwest into Mexico is one of the earliest known Hispanic writings about the later U.S. and may be considered the foundational text of Mexican-American literature. Interesting, by a Spaniard. It is also one of the earliest expressions of the great U.S. tradition of writing about nature. In his text, Cabeza de Vaca describes the wild nature of the Caribbean and the North American mainland, their topography, flora, fauna, and climate as a powerful presence. We talked about the Caribbean writers. Here, this reiterates that. He dwells on the challenges and perils nature poses to Spaniards as well as to the autochthons. I don't like that word from the Greek word autochthonous. It's hard to pronounce, but it means indigenous, original inhabitants. An instance is his vivid account of the destructive impact of a Caribbean hurricane on his journey. It is one of a number of first written descriptions of the American lands found in this text. And he also talks about the hardships as well as the fitness for cultivation of the land. And he expresses wonder at the landscape as he travels through present-day Florida. This is what he calls it: a country that was marvelous to see, filled with large forests and amazingly tall trees, where there were Native Americans living, right? The Seminole tribe especially. So I thought I'd share that. And now what I'd like to do, well, let me just mention Baca for a second because I want to read another poem. Here. So Baca, just to reiterate, he's got dead birds as well as live birds, but he's got images of that are kind of violent, as I said, as well as benign, right? So he's not gonna. These are mixed together. Breakage, frightful breakage, upturned claws, but it's also in his backyard that is something that would normally invite a kind of peaceful image, right? And so by backyard, he does mean literally his backyard, but metaphorically that area of the Black Mesa, right? In whose shadow so many people live. First, the original inhabitants, both Mexican and his Native American, but now many others, right, where it's developed. Here's another poem. In terms of, as you can see, I've been trying to also look back at some of the, just to give us an overview, a context for this. Read from a poet I mentioned, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, Jose Marti, the great Cuban writer who lived only from 1853 to 1895. So he died just 42 or something. But he's the national poet of Cuba. But he also is recognized throughout the many parts of the Hispanic world, Latin American world, as being an important voice for independence in the late 1800s. By independence meaning ostensibly these countries are independent, but it's the rich who control them, right? It's neocolonialism. He even goes to New York, by the way, and lives there for a couple of years. There's a famous song that was popularized in America in the 1960s. My students never know it, which is Guantanamera. But if you're interested, look it up. It's a wonderful song. My daughter was in Cuba for 4 months as a student. And apart from Che Guevara, who's very famous, there's this song is still sung a lot, Guantanamera. And it was popularized by folk singers in the 1960s and also by Jose Feliciano. And I can see I'm kind of going off the topic, but let me read the original of it, which is by Jose Marti. And the song, if you hear it, it's very catchy. It adapts this. So it's not, you won't hear the exact same words. Also, it's in Spanish. But I'm going to read, I'm not a Spanish reader, but it starts, Yo soy un hombre sincero. I am a humble, sincere man. I'm a sincere man. And that's sort of, he doesn't give it a title, so it's just the title from this. And that does come up in Guantanamera. I would sing it for you, but I don't know all the words. From the land where palm trees, I want you to hear the arboreal and floral imagery. And it's about a longing for home and a celebration of this Cuban home. From the land where palm trees grow, I am a sincere man am I. This is how it's translated. from the land where palm trees grow, and I want, before I die, my soul's verses to bestow. So it's in rhyming, and the translator has kept the rhyme. I'm a traveler to all parts, and a newcomer to none. I am art among the arts, with the mountains I am one. I know how to name and class all the strange flowers that grow. I know every blade of grass, fatal lie and sublime woe. I have seen through dead of night upon my head softly fall rays formed of the purest light from the beauty celestial. I have seen wings that were surging from beautiful women's shoulders and seen butterflies emerging from the refuse heap that molders. I have known a man to live with a dagger at his side and never once the name give of she by whose hand he died. But very romantic. Twice for an instant did I my soul's reflection espy, twice when my poor father died, and when she bade me goodbye. I trembled once when I flung the vineyard gate, and to my dread the wicked hornet had stung my little girl on the forehead. I rejoiced once and felt lucky the day that my jailer came to read the death warrant to me that bore his tears in my name. I hear a sigh across the earth. I hear a sigh over the deep. It is no sign reaching my hearth, but my son waking from sleep. If they say I have obtained the pick of the jeweler's trove, a good friend is what I've gained, and I have put aside love. I have seen across the skies a wounded eagle still flying. I know the cubby where lies the snake of its venom dying. I know that the world is weak, and that must soon fall to the ground, then the gentle brook will speak above the quiet profound. While trembling with joy and dread, I have touched with hand so bold a once bright star that fell dead from heaven at my threshold. On my brave heart is engraved the sorrow hidden from all eyes. The son of a land enslaved lives for it, suffers and dies. All is beautiful and right, all is music and reason, and all like diamonds is light that was cold before its season. I know when fools are laid to rest, honor and tears will abound, and that of all the fruits, the best is left to rot in holy ground. Without a word, the pompous muse I've set aside and understood. From a withered branch I choose to hang my doctoral hood. So it ends there. On a branch, from a withered branch, I choose to hang my doctoral hood, which is the hood you get hooded when you become a PhD.
What's the title of the book?
Oh, the title. Sorry, I was wondering. Yeah, the title is actually it's just called it's called Guantanamera sometimes, and sometimes it's called by the first name, Yo soy un hombre sincero. And again, this adaptation became a popular folk song. What's interesting is, here's a footnote. Guantanamera means the person from Guantanamo. And we don't have to say what Guantanamo is, which is a sad corruption of what is a very nice place, actually. The American military took over and made into a prison. So that was he wrote this before that, but that's what it means. So that becomes all the more poignant in present-day Cuba. Right. What I wanted to say was that you see some similar imagery to, of course, Baca, but Martí was important for a lot of countries because he talked about he has a famous phrase, our America. So America had already become in the 19th century, when we say America, that's really it's kind of like the United States co-opting a term that really should apply to, and does, apply to the Americas. So he consciously, through language, says we have to, as best he can do through language, we have to not recapture, but to find a way to have access to the language that America has used, has co-opted for its own. Does that make sense? So the United States of America, sometimes called American, but what does it mean to be American, right? We had Vespucci's map, Vespucci on the map, I mean, Vespucci on the engraving, the map maker, and that's telling, right? Because the European map then gives the name to the lands. So how do you change that? The Aboriginals in Australia have to do the same, right? You have to, naming is such a big part of this. So that's one of the things he was self-conscious about. The other thing is he's talking in metaphors. When he talks about his son and daughter, it's not, in this case, real. He's trying to be the voice for the Americas that are subjugated. Now, on one level, he's Cuban, so he's talking about his homeland, the palm trees, from the land where the palm trees grow, but he's also conscious that this can be many places. So he's working on two levels, and he's not strictly autobiographical, it's more collective. Does that make sense? So you have to read it metaphorically. So he's the son of a land enslaved, and so he's going to work for that. What I find fascinating is this occurs, he's contemporary with, as I mentioned, Jose Rizal, who died executed in the Philippines, and also wrote in Spanish. So the Spanish-speaking world is interesting, right? It's cross-oceanic. It's when you go to Manila, you go to say Colombia, and you go to southwestern U.S., you see the same architecture, and you say Orgoa, and then you say, wait a minute, I'm having deja vu, right? Uncanny. That's the power of place, but that's the built environment, right, that humans have built intentionally to kind of replicate themselves. Just as coins, I'm getting a little off topic, but just as coins were used by kings to spread their message, right? That was the social media. That was Snapchat. No, I don't know, of the time. Okay, now we go to Helen Maria Viramontes, Under the Feet of Jesus. What's interesting is that she now is not part Native American. She's, but Baca speaks for Hispanics, to be sure. But she is purely Mexican American. But what's interesting is even in, as we saw with Mamade, we have Christianity playing a role mixed with indigenous religions. Here, you don't get that. You don't get indigeneity in the same sense because these are Mexican immigrants. But notice the title, "Under the Feet of Jesus," which becomes a metaphor as well as literal. So the summary is California migrant farm workers. Very big topic in the United States. In my campus, there's a name given to a famous farm worker activist, right, who has died a few years ago. But this was a time, which I learned much later, a time in the 50s and 60s when Mexican-American activists were marching for civil rights for the farm laborers who were paid in pittance and were, getting pesticides. So this has pesticides in it, the novel. And it focuses again on a young girl, Estrella, a 13-year-old girl. And by the way, Estrella means star, right? So keep that in mind. Who with her family must constantly move from job to job. Estrella's father has abandoned his family of 5 kids, leaving their very religious mother, Petra Rock, to raise them. She takes as a partner Perfecto Flores, the perfect flower, but he's a man, who helps raise the kids. The book begins with Perfecto driving Estrella and her family in an old beat-up car in need of a new battery to the newest job opportunity, working the grape fields. The family moves into a decaying bungalow near an old barn, which itself is a symbol of dilapidation. Uh, so she has, again, this extended family. Two cousins arrived, and one of them she becomes close to, and of course the parents don't like this, right? Um, but they're kind of out in the middle of this farmland. They're kind of cut off from everyday life. Um, and Perfecto has become a live-in partner, and he's a good guy, but he's a live-in partner of the mother. Um, and he's saving up to try to return to Mexico. Right now, we have a lot of workers still to this day. I remember we had someone who worked in our house with digging up the yard, the ground for piping and all. And we've talked to him a lot, and he's very industrious. He's a Hispanic, uh, Mexican American who is undocumented. So he has to be careful about where he opens a bank account. This is a common part of the U.S., in the U.S., but his children have gone to college and, done very well. Um, but many of them are sending money, as you know, back home. As we know this about many migrant workers. Um, but the sad thing is that Jose, whom we know, can't return home because he couldn't be able to come back to the U.S. Right? And remember the borderlands. There's a lot of, as you know, uh, like refugees crossing into Europe. It's the same way that where they'll pay someone to take them across, and it's very dangerous. In fact, anyway, yeah, I could say more about that. But so this is set some time ago, but the novel came out in 1995, but it's set in the like 70s, I think. But the point is, it's not set in the present, but uh, it things are slightly better for the laborers, but it's still tough. Now, at some point, Alejo, who's the cousin she likes, is accidentally doused with pesticide from a plane in a peach orchard, and he is bedridden. He gets very, very sick. He gets worse. So they take him to a clinic, and all they say is, oh, you got to be in the hospital, right? And so they try to charge them money because they don't have insurance. And Estrella gets so angry that she takes a crowbar and smashes the table. This is the young girl, right? And she's sort of sticking up for the family. And she smashes the table and orders the nurse to give them back their money. Now they're worried that the police might come and so forth. So these are the kinds of experiences they have that happen. Perfecto um, begins to cry. So here's the sort of the man of the house, and he's a decent guy, but it's intentionally in this sort of making the man of the house cry versus the woman. And Petra turns to prayer, and um, this is what happens when she goes to pray in the church and accidentally knocks down the statue of Jesus. And she says, what's interesting about the title, it's also literal. Under the feet of Jesus, it turns out, are some documents that she has hidden, right? So she, however, is so devout that she feels, oh, this is terrible, right? And so she's kind of gets into a depression. But on the other hand, they find these documents, Estrella does, and that will potentially help them. But at the end of the novel, it's rather poetic. She goes to the barn roof, which is the dilapidated symbol of dilapidation, goes to the top of it and looks at the stars. And her name is Estrella, right? So this identification with nature. Now, what's interesting is I don't know quite how to, there are different ways to interpret this because they are not in a homeland. They are suffering from pesticides, right? Being dropped from airplanes. And this is again in the 60s and 70s where there's no protection. It's potentially going to kill Alejo, the young man. And yet there's this connection to nature in some way. right? So I'm not sure. There are different ways to read this. But you can see the issues of how post-colonial critique works, right? The dominance here. And you can also see this idea of the term that we use a lot these days, rightly so, is precarity, this precarious existence that is almost hand to mouth and it is sometimes a matter of life and death, right? But it also has themes of literacy as empowering. Um, so, for example, there's this section that says she lifted the pry bar in her hand, felt the coolness of the iron and power of function, weighed the significance it rewarded her, and soon she came to understand how essential it was to know these things. That was when she began to read. Interesting conjunction. So this kind of crowbar thing, tool, and she intuitively understands, Estrella does, that she needs to learn to read. There's also the theme of invisibility, of non-white laborers and their exploitation, both physical and psychological. Um, Now, besides the pesticide, Petra, who's only a mother who's only in her mid-30s, she was a very young mother to begin with. Her legs are already failing her because of the harsh labor conditions. When Estrella thanks Perfecto for driving her sick cousin to the hospital, Perfecto is so taken aback that because no one has thanked him for his 30 years of work in the American farmland. He's never been thanked for anything. So let me read this section. He had given this country his all, and in this land that used his bones for kindling, in this land that never once in the 30 years he lived and worked, never once said thank you, this young woman, who could be his granddaughter, had said the words with such honest gratitude, he was struck by how deeply these words touched him. Getting back to the statue, I just, the documents I knew I was forgetting something. The documents that the mother had hid there were the birth certificates of the children so that they could claim American citizenship because they then would not be undocumented. But the tragedy is that the mother doesn't she had thought that knocking over the statue was her undoing and so forth, but at least there's hope. So some questions I would ask if I were teaching this would be, how does the novel invite this eco-critical reading, of course, but who benefits from their labor, right? You don't have that many whites here. You do have one or two, but it's clear that their labor, they're being squeezed by a system that doesn't give them much of a leg up, as we say in the U.S. A couple of other themes I'd like to mention, and then we'll see. Advertisements. So here's another conjunction, and it'd be interesting to look at some of these, but I didn't think to you can look at these online, but so California raisins is a big industry. Raisins, you dried grapes. And so there's an ad she describes an ad in the novel of a woman wearing a fluffy bonnet holding out the grapes with her smiling ruby lips. And then the next a few lines, pages later, but picking grapes makes Estrella's back but Estrella's back coiled like barbed wire. So the conjunction of that, so you don't see, you're on the farmland all the time, but the advertisement, the commodity culture and so forth. Women who labor, so there's a lot of focus on women, and on top of the labor that everyone does, they of course have to keep up the labor of the house. They're expected to. Financial injustice, patriarchal habits, abandonment. So a big theme in some of these novels is abandonment. As the fathers run off, the mothers remain to take care of the children. because after all, her family's position depends on, quote, the harvest, the car running, their health, the conditions of the road, how long the money will hold out, and the weather. Any one of which can knock them off. And this kind of work, of course, is inconsistent because it's seasonal. Um, there's a constant fear. The other thing I would say is a constant fear of, and this runs throughout a lot of modern um, Hispanic American literature, is the constant fear of immigration and police officers. Immigration officers, police officers. So a friend of mine, unfortunately, it's gotten worse. So a friend of mine in the city of Minneapolis works with, she speaks Spanish, she works with undocumented workers. One day, soon after the new administration took effect, plainclothes immigration officers showed up at the schools where her children were to arrest the parents. They knew that's where the parents would come. And they didn't arrest the children, but where are the children going to go then, right? So it's cruel, it's humane, it's anti-humanitarian. So these things are still there. So I think you could look at African American literature, and film often has this same kind of fear of figures of authority, uniform. We see that in Mahashweta Devi's writing too, of uniformed, whether they're forest officers or whatever, police. They use the modern words, right? Police, because those are the modern state ideological apparatuses, right? As Althusser says. So this is very much a strain of fear, I would say, but also resistance and resilience. So we mustn't make it a story of victimology, but nonetheless the reality. Finally, there are biblical figures, because some of the characters are not religious at all, but nonetheless, if they are religious, it's the sort of Catholicism that is important to this family. There's a Moses-like figure, images. For example, she lifted her arms, her palms up, and then spread them wide as the twins watched as she stepped forward, and the glass doors split open before her, obeying her command. And like parting the seas, right? I don't know if you know that image. And also, Estrella parted the doors like a sea of glass and walked through. There's sort of some humor here, too. Other images, interesting. The termite softened, shakes, crunched beneath her bare feet, like the serpent under the feet of Jesus. Or Estrella stood immobile, like an angel standing on the verge of faith. Interesting statements, right? Petra, it's not a religious novel in that sense, typically. Petra begins to question her faith near the end of the novel, as we've said, but at the clinic, Estrella decides that God was mean and did not care, and she was alone to fend for herself, right? So it's this idea, again, a young person's view of, as in many post-colonial novels, right? A young girl's point of view, perhaps. There are some unglossed words, a couple of which, maybe only one of which, is known in American sort of everyday culture, mainstream culture. There's the pescadores. These are the pickers of fruit and vegetables. The one that's known, unfortunately, is la migra, capitalized, which is slang for U.S. government enforcement, border agents. La migra. Very well known in the U.S. I mean, by everyone. But there's also La Virgen, the Virgin Mary, nopales, shoots, the shoots of a prickly pear cactus, which you can buy in the stores all throughout the U.S. because Mexican Americans eat them, and apparently they're quite delicious. I didn't know this word before, but cicadas, they eat cicadas. Chicaras. Chanclazo, slang for being whacked by sandals. combining the words, two different words, and comal, a cast iron cookisms, and they can go back to, say, Mexico or wherever their parents are from, or relatives, they'll be kind of laughed at. So it's interesting that the subject position changes. So when they go there, though, they accentuate their Americanness, because sort of like we're the cool Americans, right? And they've told me this, right? But when they're in America, they have a different subject position, right? And so then they're kind of not on a par with everyone. I think it's changing for sure. We have a lot of throughout the U.S. Almost every state except maybe Hawaii and Alaska, we have farm laborers who are Hispanics, and their children now are in the school systems and coming to our university, and they're doing quite well. And so it's interesting to see that generational change, but they are still sometimes not counted in the census because if their parents are undocumented, or they are they sort of keep a low profile. But I think it's getting better. So I wanted to mention that. The other thing about let me see if there was another note I wanted here. So as we, yeah, the thing with, so when we come back and sort of round out today's lectures, what I'd like to reemphasize is this idea of post-colonial environments, and maybe I thought it might be good to see what, if I can find it here. There's a wonderful story. I wish I had time to read, but no time. It's a longer one. Sorry, I just had it here. Yeah, here we go. So, Pablo, just as a kind of closure to today, zooming back out, there are many books available on these subjects. More specific books would be, if I can mention a couple, anthologies, which are very useful. And I haven't looked at them all. And these are three that are fairly recent. In order of appearance, one is Ecological Crisis and Cultural Representation in Latin America, Eco-Critical Perspectives on Art, Film, and Literature, 2016. Another one is the Latin American Eco-Cultural Reader, 2020. And a third is Hispanic Eco-Criticism, 2019. What's interesting about the last one, as I discovered, was that by Hispanic it includes Spanish from Spain, but it does include the Americas. So that's even wider ranging. But it's by a noted critic named Jose Manuel Marrero Enriquez. I like that long name. And he is Spanish. He often writes from Spain, and he writes in Spanish, but this is in English. So there are many works on Hispanic literature in Spanish from the Americas, understandably, other parts of the Americas, but it's a growing field. That's what I wanted to mention. The other thing I thought it would be useful to do is Pablo Mukherjee, who's a prominent post-colonial critic, has worked on books in different areas. So his 2010 book is still valuable. He reads Amitav Ghosh, Indra Sinha, and so forth. And what he says here, I thought might be valuable. Well, he quotes Graham Huggan, who I mentioned in passing the other day, who talks about the post-colonial exotic. So now we talk about what are the novels, that sell. So, for example, Jimmy Santiago Baca is not someone widely. First of all, poetry tends not to be as widely read as the novel. Many theories about that. Anyway. Secondly, it's just there are sort of these larger. There sort of seem to be a handful of writers who attract and get taught, and then that becomes part of this exotic. What the argument is that which Pablo Mukherjee picks up from Graham Huggan, is that some of these writings, and I think this pertains more to some of the, not to the ones I just discussed today, but perhaps to the more recent novels like Indra Sinha's novel or some of the others, would be a kind of calling attention in their own, sometimes exaggerated scenes, calling attention to the exoticism of so-called third world, which we don't use anymore, but that's what they want to do. They themselves are exaggerating this to sort of say, hey, is this what you think of us? Okay, here's what you go. And then you have to read between the lines. I'm thinking of Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where it's a wonderful, I love the way he works with memory, right? But at the same time, it works on the trope of honor, avenging honor, right? He kind of has fun with this. So there's an argument to be made that perhaps in some of these novels, not all, they are not necessarily all earnest. And again, I don't think this applies to the ones I've talked about today. And I don't think you have to be self-conscious, sort of coy and wry about it. But there is an argument to be made where, say, Arundhati Roy or an Indra Sinha may be exaggeratedly presenting exaggerations or dramatic scenes and having fun with them, like the picaresque idea, in order to call attention to what the mainstream media, especially the Western media, does by commodifying and this exotic stuff, selling it. Does that make sense? So it's better for you to read this on your own. And so this is on pages 8 and 9 mostly of 8, 9, 10, 11 of his book in his introduction. So I thought I would mention this. And then he talks about the literariness of Indian literature and a lot of literature. So there's also a kind of, remember I said that, and I'm almost done with my thought here. I said that there's a lot of popular Native American writing that takes their folk traditions and dramatizes it. Eco-horror, right? And it's taking these guys know, these writers, they're writing for a broad audience, right? So they know that they're playing with a kind of trope that can become kind of trite. That is to say, the horror film, like the typical Hollywood horror film, is very, predictable, and it's about screaming and all this stuff. Well, they're going to take that and play with your expectations about what that means. And so sometimes in a typical if you're looking at a typical film, mainstream media, and it has a ghost, it's not like expecting you necessarily to believe in those ghosts. It's working off the dramatic scare tactics, right? Whereas in these, a spirit or a ghost may be taken at face value, right? It becomes a more philosophical idea. So I just wanted to say that they are using these genre modes, and there's still a bias against genre writing versus literary writing that I think it'd be nice to break down more between popular and genre. Now, that's not to say there's a lot of bad popular writing, but there are some very clever ways of playing with that, which points to also the expectations of the publishing industry. After all, this is a market. We can never forget that, sadly. So that's why someone like Jean Toomer Kane doesn't really become famous, influential till later. It's not written with the intent of selling. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I believe that's the end of lecture 12. End of day 4 on our journey through the apocalypse.